Good evening. On behalf of Arts Empowering Life, we welcome you, good evening. On behalf of Arts Empowering Life, we welcome you to God of Our Fathers, the series that recognizes the mighty miracles of the American Revolution. My name is Sister Danielle Dwyer, and along with Lillian Meow, we serve as the coordinators of this series. As we look toward our country's 250th anniversary, we wanted to take time to highlight those moments of divine intervention, incredible measures of faith and courage, moments that reveal and outline the hand of God over our nation. So, in each month between now and July 2026, we will be hosting a lecture on an event that happened in that month during the American Revolution. Tonight is the Battle of Saratoga, and we're delighted to have with us Bill Federer to speak about this moment in history. A little bit about him. William J. Bill Federer was born and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and was the fifth of 11 children. With a business degree in accounting from St. Louis University, Bill expanded into real estate, oil, and gas. He's also a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch Incorporated, a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America on the internet. His Faith and History television airs on the TCT network, on stations across America, and via DirecTV, and he has authored more than 25 books. Many call upon Bill for his knowledge of the details and facts that make up our noble heritage. One such person who would call upon him was Charlie Kirk. We learned just recently how they had a close working relationship. And we are grateful to Bill for keeping us on his calendar on such a weekend as this. Many of us in this room have family and friends who have headed out to Arizona to celebrate the life, legacy, and call of God upon the life of Charlie Kirk. Bill leaves tomorrow or tonight at 3 a.m. to join those in Arizona, and we ask that you pray with us for his safe travel. Now, a few housekeeping items. At the end of the lecture, there will be a chance for questions. Please come to the microphone here in the aisle, and if you're unable to do that, we will bring a microphone to you. Now, join with me in welcoming Bill Federer as he talks with us tonight about the Battle of Saratoga.
Thank you. God bless you. God bless you. Well, it is a tremendous honor for me to be with you, and I so much appreciate Sister Danielle and Sister Mercy and each and every one of you. Little background, about 2014, I was speaking in Robinson, Illinois, and I was the main speaker to about 500 people, and there was this young 19-year-old that was the warm-up speaker. And he had just gotten out of high school and was taking a year off before college giving talks, and he was really good. And I remember I couldn't even concentrate on my notes because he was talking about the Constitution being the greatest political document in world history and all these things, and it was Charlie Kirk. And we got to be friends, and I've spoken across the country with him. We've driven in cars together for hours, and he would ask me all kinds of history questions, and he'd text me, tell me about John Adams, and tell me about the Treaty of Tripoli, and tell me about this, and about socialism, and I'd give him answers back, and he would text scriptures. And I mean, on Easter this past year, I texted him Keith Green's Easter song. I like that. I said, and he texted me back, and he says, Romans 10:9 and 10, that if we confess Jesus Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. We need to tell everybody about the resurrection of Jesus with more boldness. And this was the type of, and so I was with him 4 days before he died in Seoul, Korea. And they had a big turning point event over there. It's called Build Up Korea. Thousands of these Korean young people. And I was the warm-up speaker for Charlie Kirk. And he goes, this is an international movement. And we were visiting with a pastor who, I don't know if you're, basically they had their election stolen and they have a communist president of South Korea who's now arresting pastors. And it's terrible. And so Charlie says, I'm going to tell everybody in America, I'm going to call President Trump. I got one last meeting in Utah with students, and then I'm going to make this my main focus. But he texted me the day before he got shot, and it was 1 Corinthians 16:9. There are a wide door of effective ministry, but there are many adversaries. And, some young person did a video, and he says, this is the turning point. He says, unless a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears forth fruit. And he says, this is obviously referring to Jesus, but it's also referring to believers throughout history and to Charlie Kirk. Instead of there being one, he says that thousands, what other 31-year-old do you know of that dies, and there's 1 million people in London, in South Korea, in Cambodia, all around the world. They've had 60,000 requests to open Turning Point chapters on high schools and colleges in the last week. And so they rented the 75,000 seat NFL stadium for tomorrow, and they're expecting over 100,000. They have 300,000 we're wanting to go. And so this is something that's beyond a single person. And I do think it's the Spirit of the Lord wanting to raise up young people. And so somebody did an AI picture of Charlie walking the white steps up to heaven, and there's Jesus waiting to greet him, and he's turning and he's passing the baton to hundreds of young people that are reaching up. And I think that's the grain of wheat that fell into the ground, and now there's a harvest coming up. But I want to get into my presentation on Battle of Saratoga. And so I hopefully can figure out how to make the clicker work. Switch on the side. That'll turn it on. All right, let's see here. Okay, there. My wife and I actually did a series of books called Miracles in American History. The War of 1812, the Civil War, the Barbary Pirate War, all the way up where there's times where it looks hopeless, and then things turn around. And let's see here, one of these buttons works. If anybody knows a little bit more about this than me, feel free to come up and help me out here. Anyway, I think I'm going to maybe just stand down there on the floor and so let's see. Would it help if I stand down on the floor and click it, or if you want to? There we go. Which button is it? Okay, there we go. All right. So June 1777, General Burgoyne's plan was that he would land in Canada and march 6,000 troops down from Canada through New York to the capital of Albany. He was also going to have General Barry St. Ledger march west, and then General William Howe would march up the Hudson River. So it was going to be a pincer movement. And Albany is the capital of New York, and this splits. I guess I need to shave or something. The Hudson River splits America in half, with New England on one side and the southern middle colonies on the other side. But the military was not based on merit. It was based on if you are a royalty person with connections to the king. And so there was competition. And so General Burgoyne's plan was this, but General William Howe's plan was to capture Philadelphia. European warfare was if you capture your enemy's capital, the war's over. And so Howe said, I can capture Philadelphia, but he doesn't tell General Burgoyne. So General Burgoyne is coming down the Hudson River Valley. He's expecting to get help from the side, but he doesn't. And then General Barry St. Clair's troops from the west are also stopped. So again, here's the map, and you can see there's Barry St. Ledger's coming. He's going to try to get Fort Stanwix, and he's defeated at this Battle of Oriskany, and then Howe never ever shows up, and then and again, here's another map. Howe's route was the red from the south, Ledger's route was green from the west, and then Burgoyne's route was down. Now, St. Ledger advanced to wage a 21-day siege of Fort Stanwix, but was halted by the Americans. And the famous general was Herkimer, and I actually was there in that area, stayed a couple days years ago, and he's wounded in the leg, and he's still directing the battle, and he eventually dies. But this meant that Burgoyne is not going to get any help from the west, and there's a movie about it, The Drums Along the Mohawks, so if you like to watch old movies. So Burgoyne sent Hessians to raid Bennington, but they were defeated by the American Brigadier General John Stark and Lieutenant Colonel Seth Warner. So again, things aren't going good for Burgoyne. And then here's General William Howe. He chose to abandon Burgoyne's plan and capture Philadelphia, which he did. And it caused George Washington to have to go to Valley Forge. And so the British for 8 months ruled the capital in Philadelphia. But Americans didn't surrender. They simply moved the capital. When they were evacuating, they gave their last order to George Washington. Until further notice, you're in charge of America. It's like, don't forget to turn the lights out, you know. And so really the whole thing was resting on Washington. But anyway, here you have Burgoyne is in Philadelphia, and the Shippen family were merchants that were loyalists, and so they sort of liked the British being there. And why is that important? Well, after 8 months, the British are driven out, the Americans come in, and the daughter, Peggy Shippen, is the one that falls in love with Benedict Arnold, and then talks Benedict Arnold into becoming a British loyalist instead of a patriot. So George Washington, he's driven out of Philadelphia and has the Valley Forge. This is where you have Baron von Steuben come, and he trains the troops. And so Burgoyne recaptures Fort Ticonderoga, and he's headed down. Now, Fort Ticonderoga was built by the French, and everything west of the Appalachians was French territory, and then everything east was British. And then this changed with the French and Indian War. And the British went west and were headed toward Pittsburgh, and that's the Battle of Monongahela. The British General George Braddock gets wounded and then killed, and then George Washington is a young colonel. He's now in charge, and he gets a couple of horses shot out from under him. He has bullet holes through his coat, and he survives. And he gets back to Fort Cumberland and writes a letter to his brother, and he said, as I have heard since my arrival at this place, a detailed account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity to deny the first and tell you I've not as yet composed the latter. And but at that point, the British now have Pittsburgh, and eventually the British win, and the French flee west of the Mississippi and found St. Louis, Missouri. And so that's where I'm from. And so the Fort Ticonderoga used to be French, but now it's British. And it was captured by the American General Benedict Arnold. And also Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen. And you know that Ethan Allen surprises the British general at night, and because they snuck into the Ticonderoga fort, and they wake up the British general, and he says, "What's going on?" And he demands he surrenders. Well, in whose name? And he goes, "In the name of the mighty Jehovah and the Continental Congress." And so that's what America gets, Fort Ticonderoga. Well, when the British come down, the Americans have to abandon it, and then the British recapture it. In the meantime, though, before it was recaptured, Henry Knox took all the cannons, about 50 of the cannons away, and brought them to Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. But anyway, the British recapture. Now they're headed down the Hudson River, and that's the Ethan Allen picture. So Burgoyne makes a treaty with the Mohawk Indians to terrorize the Americans. So he promised them money for scalps. So the Mohawk would go in front of the British Army and scalp the Americans. Now, the British were known to do this tactic. That's how they took over India. In 1714, the British landed in Bengal and opened a trading post that turned into a trading fort, which turned into them having guns. And then they would give guns to one kingdom in India, and then the guns would go to another kingdom in India, and then they would stir up animosity between the kingdoms, and they would fight each other and weaken each other. And then the British could conquer both of the weakened kingdoms really easily. And they would do this again and again and again till they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. And so this idea is you come into America and you stir up the Indians to fight the Americans. And they did this, both the French and the British did this during the French and Indian War. And the Indians that sided with the French, when the French lost, the Indians lost, and so the British took over a lot of that territory. So the British said, we learned our lesson. This time we're going to side with the British. And so the Indians would go in front of the British Army and scalp the Americans. It was so bad that it is listed as one of the 27 reasons why we rebelled against the King of England. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson says, so that the world will know that we didn't enter into this, very lightly. These are the things. The king has, raised up taxation without representation. He's raided our coasts. But one of them is he has incited the merciless savage on our frontiers to butcher the inhabitants of our settlements. And so it's in the Declaration of Independence that the British would incite. So here's Burgoyne, and there's a Fort Edward. It's a loyalist fort. There's a guy named David Jones, and it's 50 miles north of Albany. He's engaged to a pretty girl named Jane McCrae, and when Burgoyne lands in Canada, David Jones decides that he's going to kiss his fiancée goodbye and go up and join the British Army and help get rid of these American rebels and then get married and have a great life. Well, the problem was the Indians couldn't tell who was an American and who was a British loyalist. We all sort of looked the same to them. And so there's Burgoyne. And so the Indians would go out in front of the army and attack. There are reports that at nighttime, the Americans would send out 30 guys to do reconnaissance, sort of checking where the enemy is. Only 3 would return. Because the Indians, they owned the night. I mean, they could, and so here they would put the scalps on sticks, and then they would do their scalp dance. And they'd hoop and holler, and they'd have the scalps up on sticks, and they'd come back in. And so one night, David Jones is in the British camp with Burgoyne, and the Indians come in, and they're holding up, and he sees this one scalp of this nice, really pretty long hair that he recognized as his fiancee's. Jane McRae. Sure enough, the Indians attacked Fort Edward. They captured her. They were fighting over who was going to get her, and the one pulls out a gun and shoots her, and they scalp her. And then, so the soldiers go to Burgoyne and say, "What were you thinking?" The Indians can't tell who's an American, who's a loyal British. So Burgoyne has to go to the Indians and tell them to tone it down. Now, the Indians don't know tone it down. They know on, they know off. When it's off, they're really, really peaceful. When they get into the war mode, it's full war. And so the Indians get offended and leave. And so suddenly you have an entire British army in the thick of the New York forest, and they do not know where they're at. The Indians had been their eyes, their ears, their reconnaissance, right? And now all of a sudden the Indians are gone. And the British are like, where are we? Where are the Americans? And they don't have any intel. And so the Americans then are able to get the advantage and surround the British, and that's the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the hero of the Battle of Saratoga was Benedict Arnold. He had an attitude. He was from Rhode Island, and sorry. And different people would be promoted to general, but the Continental Congress decided, well, let's be fair and let's promote the generals equally from every colony. And since Rhode Island has already had enough people promoted to general, we're not going to promote any more from Rhode Island. We'll promote the other people from the other colonies. And so people that were under Benedict Arnold are now over him. And that's when he has a little attitude. He was on Lake Champlain. He was fighting some of the British ships. And he would be short-tempered with some of the people. He was courageous. There was a battle, sort of like a George Washington, where he was on his horse and the British were charging, and he was rallying them to fight. And so for a while, he was more popular than George Washington. Now, at the Battle of Saratoga, he gets into an argument with General Gates the day before the battle. And Gates says, you know what? I'm going to have you sit out the Battle of Saratoga. You're just going to sit in your little tent while we all go out and fight. And here he is sitting there. Everybody's going off and fight. And he takes a swig of whiskey, and he gets on his horse, and he starts charging toward the battle. And as he's going toward the battle, there's a redoubt, which is a fortified area where they raise up the dirt, and then the British are shooting. And he sees that the British are shooting this way, and the Americans are shooting this way, and he's riding from the side, and he sees that there's nobody, they're not protected on the side. They're not anticipating getting attacked from. So he gets a bunch of men, and they charge right across the field. They go right to this redoubt, and they defeat it, they conquer it, and so that removes all these British guns so that the Americans can advance. And he gets wounded, he falls, the horse falls on him, it injures his leg, but he comes away with the glory of the Battle of Saratoga, right? So Benedict Arnold is now the most popular military person in America. Well, what happened? The British surrendered 6,000 soldiers. That's a big deal. I mean, imagine today if any country got 6,000 of their soldiers captured. And so that was the effect of the battle. So here's one of the paintings. That's Benedict Arnold on his horse, and you can see the person shooting. And then here's another picture. There's Benedict Arnold. You see his ankle got shot. He actually lost about an inch of height, when they finally had the doctor worked on it, right? But there he is with his horse. See how his horse is sort of down on the ground, and he's sort of pinned there. And then again, there's Benedict Arnold on his horse. So this painting of the surrender of Burgoyne to General Gates is so important, it's in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. So how many of you have been to Washington, D.C., right? They have, it's either 4 or 6 of these huge murals. They have the pilgrims on the deck of the Mayflower with an open Bible. Another one is the baptism of Pocahontas. She took the name Rebecca, became a Christian, right? But they have the picture of the surrender of the 6,000 British soldiers at the Battle of Saratoga. And it was so monumental that, well, here's George Washington. He writes after the battle, "I most devoutly congratulate my country and every well-wisher to the cause on this signal stroke of providence." Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary defines providence as the will of God. Right? There was just another respectful way of saying the will of God. And so news of the victory goes across the Atlantic to Ben Franklin, who's ambassador to Paris. And King Louis XVI was hesitating getting involved in the war because the French had lost the French and Indian War, and they lost everything west of the Appalachians. They lost, and so they're like, we're not in a hurry to get into another battle with Britain, another war. But when Ben Franklin goes in there, so he's bowing there on the side. There's King Louis XVI. There's another picture. There's Franklin before Louis XVI. And he's giving him this report that the Americans captured 6,000 British. And King Louis XVI is like, well, maybe I'll consider. And that was strategic in sending Rochambeau and the French Navy and de Grasse to help at the Battle of Yorktown and so forth. 19-year-old French guy, Marquis de Lafayette, he's related through marriage to the king. He was just a young boy. He gets into the military, works his way up. His dad dies. He's like a young, wealthy guy. He's 19, and he's like, very high up in the French military. He's been through all their training. And when the American Revolution starts, and King Louis XVI is like, I'm not ready to get involved yet, Marquis de Lafayette gets a bunch of his French officer friends, buys a boat, and without the approval of the king, comes over to America. And so it was a faux pas. It was like an embarrassment. He comes across, he's considered an adopted son of Washington, because Washington was like so proud of him. He's at the Battle of Brandywine. He gets wounded, he recovers, he fights in these battles, but George Washington says, look, I could really use your help to get France involved. So he's over in France, sort of with Ben Franklin, lobbying. But when Marquis de Lafayette goes back over to France, he has to hide in his house for a month in repentance before he's allowed to come into the presence of the king. Right? Sort of a little bit in the Bible, there's David, and he brings back his son Absalom, right? But then Absalom was like, when do I get the chance to come into your presence, right? But this is what Marquis de Lafayette. But Franklin convinces them, and they do send help. Now, this is the first national day of Thanksgiving after the Declaration of Independence, and it was issued after the Battle of Saratoga. So let's read it. With one heart and one voice, join the penitent confession of their manifold sins, that it may please God, through the merits of Jesus Christ, mercifully to forgive and blot them out, and under the providence of Almighty God, secure for these United States the greatest of all human blessings, independence and peace. This is the first national day of Thanksgiving after the Declaration, and it's mentioning through the merits of Jesus Christ. And now one of the things they understood was you had to confess your sins before you could expect God to bless you. Because if God blessed you while you're in sin, he would, in effect, be giving his approval to the sin. In law, it's called the rule of tacit admission, T-A-C-I-T. Silence equals consent. So it's in real estate law. If you have a rent house and a squatter moves in, and if you know about it and you're silent for a long enough period of time, they gain title to your rent house. It's in debt collection law. Somebody owes you money, you wait 10 years to try to start collecting, the judge will say you're past the statute of limitation, you've waited too long, your silence was giving consent, no money. It's in trademark law. You design a trademark, somebody copies it, and if you know about it, you see it all over the internet, and you do not try to defend your trademark, your silence gives consent. It's in a wedding ceremony. The pastor says, anybody that's against this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you're sitting there holding your peace, you're actually giving consent to the wedding. So in scriptures, if there are sins and God is silent and not judging the sin, by default, he would be giving consent to the sin. And if God gives consent to one sin one time, he denies his just nature. He denies himself. And he cannot deny himself. So he has to judge every sin, right? And that's why the gospel is Jesus took the punishment for the sin in our place. And so we can approach God through Jesus, and he's still just. He judges every sin, but he's love in that he provided the lamb to take the judgment. Right? So there's always the preaching of the law before you see your need for the lamb. This God is just. He has to judge every sin. I said, I need help. Well, here's help, the lamb. The lamb took the judgment in your place, so now God doesn't have to change his nature. He's still just, but you can approach him and be loved and have a love relationship and don't have to worry about being judged by him because the judgment you deserve went on the lamb. Anyway, the founders understood that, so they realized that we have to confess our sins, and then through the merits of Jesus Christ, we're forgiven, the sins are blotted out, and then we can have faith that God's going to restore the blessings of peace. George Washington, now, while the Battle of Saratoga is going on, he is outside of Philadelphia, and he's at Valley Forge, and then the next spring, as they're coming out of the Valley Forge where 2,500 guys died, and 500 women. Did you know 500 women died at Valley Forge? Women were called camp followers. Now, that does not do them justice because they took care of everything. They were the logistics. They took care of the wounded. They cooked the food. They sewed the clothes and the uniforms, and they would even use their own dresses and coats, and they'd use their own clothes to make clothes for the soldiers. And then they would get sick, and then they would die. And so it's one of those they don't get the credit they deserve. Martha Washington, there was a Mrs. Westlake, and she said, Lady Washington, from morning till night, is always taking care of wounded soldiers. I've never seen a woman so busy, and so forth. And Lucy Knox, the wife of Henry Knox, and she's organized and taking care of the different soldiers. But here's George Washington. This is coming out of the Valley Forge winter, and he says, to the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian. And then the next year, some Delaware Indians, the Algonquin, come and bring some of their youth to be trained in American schools. And Washington tells them, you do well to wish to learn our arts and way of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. And so we have lots of battles. In my book, I go through all these. But if it's okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Benedict Arnold. Is that all right? So he's the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, but he's wounded. So he is now made the military governor of Philadelphia. And so he's wounded. He has to, walk with a cane. He has to sit in a chair with his leg up. But he's a hero. And so he would go to the parties. And at the parties is when he met Peggy Shippen. And so she's the daughter of the loyalist. He's a merchant there in Philadelphia. When the British were in charge, they put on plays. And they would, in the plays, mock George Washington, but they would cast Peggy Shippen in the play, and so she'd be, be able to be in front of all the people of Philadelphia. And one of the people that was involved in this was Benedict Arnold. And then when the Americans drove the British out of Philadelphia, and then the Americans come back in Philadelphia, Benedict Arnold stays. John Andre, the spy, stays. Did I say Benedict Arnold? Okay, so Benedict Arnold is now, falls in love and gets engaged and marries Peggy Shippen, but Peggy Shippen still stays in touch with John Andre, the British spy. And so after Benedict Arnold gets passed over for promotion, and then, since he's the military governor of the city, he would confiscate goods to give to the army, and there were accusations that he confiscated the goods and sold some of it on the side to make some money so that he could have a big house, because Peggy Shippen grew up rich and he wanted to make her happy, and so he had to afford a big house, and so he had to go through a court-martial, a trial. And the trial would start and stop, because there were battles, and they'd come back to it. Then there were more battles, and it drags on for a year. And it sort of is wearing psychologically on him. And meanwhile, Peggy Shippen is saying, if you were in the British Army, they wouldn't put you through all that hassle. This is one of the TV shows where they talk, that's Peggy Shippen, and she's Major John Andre, And so the Peggy Shippen nags Benedict Arnold for a year, saying, if you were in the British Army, they would recognize what a great general you are, and they wouldn't put you through all this court-martial stuff. And finally he caves, and he agrees to meet John Andre. And they meet on the Hudson River. There's a British ship called the Vulture, and it creeps up the Hudson River close to West Point. And then West Point's on the Hudson, and it's a turn in the river, and if you control West Point, you basically can control the traffic that goes up and down the Hudson River. And so the boat, the Vulture, stops. John Andre gets off. He is meeting with Benedict Arnold, and he's dressed in a British uniform. Some Americans see the British ship and just start shooting at it, and the British ship goes back down the river, and now John Andre is like stuck. And so Benedict Arnold says, well, come back to West Point, that I'm in charge of that, and I'll give you, a change of clothes. You can dress as a civilian, and you can sneak back to the British. Well, the way military etiquette is, if you are captured and you're wearing a uniform, you have rights as a prisoner, and we will save you for a prisoner exchange later. When they got some of our guys, we got you, we can sort of swap. But if you're an enemy dressed as a civilian, you're a spy, you immediately get killed. So when Benedict Arnold brings John Andre back to West Point and says, dress in some civilian clothes and sneak back, it was a question that historians wonder about. And they think that Benedict Arnold was jealous of John Andre because John Andre was more handsome and John Andre was keeping in touch with his wife. I mean, how would you like it, guys, if your wife is like, having secret conversations with some other guy? And so Benedict Arnold does this foolish thing and dresses him as a civilian. And there's West Point on the Hudson River there. So there's John Andre on the far left, dressed as a civilian. He's sneaking back across the American-controlled area. He sneaks across the no man's land area, and he's about to cross a bridge into British-controlled area when out of the woods comes Hessian soldiers. Now, Hessians were German mercenaries hired by gold by the King of England to fight the Americans. And so as John Andre is coming up to this bridge and he sees these Hessians, he blurts out, "It's finally good to see some men on our side." And the Hessians respond, "What do you mean our side?" He goes, "Well, you're Hessians. You're hired by the British." He goes, No. We're Americans dressed as Hessians to try to find people that are disloyal to America and blah, blah, blah." And he tries to talk his way out of it. He goes, "Yeah, sort of, you knew that. You don't know who you can trust nowadays." I was just sort of playing on. They go, "Yeah, we're going to search you anyway." They search him once. They search him twice. They're about to let him go. And at the last minute, they think, you know what, let's make him take off his boot. And in the stocking, after they take off the boot, is a map of West Point. And so you can see him with his boot off, and there's the guys dressed as Hessians, and there's the one guy looking at this map. Here's another picture of it, right? There's John Andre, he's got his boot off, and they're looking at this map. They're like, "You didn't tell us about this." And he goes, "Oh, yeah, the map." And he tries to talk his way out, and they say, "You know what, we'll just let you explain it to our commanding officer." Well, word ripples back to West Point, to Benedict Arnold, that John Andre, that he just let go, was captured. And if they bring him back, he's going to be caught. And so Benedict Arnold hops on that ship called the Vulture and leaves. And his wife, Peggy Shippen, is still there in the general's quarters. And George Washington, Arnold had it all planned out. Not only was he going to betray West Point to the British, he was going to do it on the day that George Washington was coming to inspect West Point. So the British would capture the fort and capture our general. And so the Washington shows up. There's no Benedict Arnold, and Peggy Shippen, she goes like nuts. She's like, "It's all your fault," and she yells at him and screams at him and everything. She goes up and locks herself in her room, and they're like, And so eventually they put her on a boat and send her to the British just to get her out of their hair. And so Benedict Arnold is then with the British, and he actually gets a commission and he fights Americans and he kills Americans. And I was with Tim Barton last night, and he knows the names and all the history, but there was a black man who was volunteered to be an American soldier with General Lafayette, and Lafayette said, "You can serve us better if you pretend like you're an escaped slave and go to the British and offer to help, but you can be a spy." And so he is there with the British, and he's hearing all these plans. And then the British, Cornwallis, says, "Hey, I need some intel. Tell you what, can you go and be a spy on the Americans?" So he's a double spy. But because of that intel, he knew that the British were going to be at Yorktown. And that's how we were able to surround and defeat them at Yorktown. But anyway, here's Benedict Arnold. He's captured. Peggy Shippen has gone nuts. And once Benedict Arnold is captured, General Nathaniel Greene writes the next day, "Treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered. General Arnold, who commanded at West Point, was about to give the American cause a deadly wound, if not fatal stab. Happily, the treason had been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to its discovery affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the object of divine protection." And then Ezra Stiles is the president of Yale. He gives an address. "A providential miracle at the last minute detected the treacherous scheme of traitor Benedict Arnold. which would have delivered the American army, including George Washington himself, into the hands of the enemy. And then the Continental Congress decides they want to have another day of Thanksgiving, October 18th, 1780, remarkable interposition of his watchful providence in the rescuing the person of our commander-in-chief and army from imminent dangers at the moment when treason was ripened for execution. It is therefore recommended a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to confess our unworthiness and to offer fervent supplications to the God of all grace to cause the knowledge of Christianity to spread over all the earth. I just think it's sort of interesting that they slipped that last part in there. It's like, we want to thank God that Washington wasn't captured. Thank God that West Point and our army wasn't captured. Oh, we want to thank God for Christianity spreading all over the earth. Right? And anyway, so did you get anything out of this?
Bill, are you willing to take some questions?
Sure.
Okay. Is there anybody who'd like to ask some questions of Bill?
I can keep talking if you want.
Well, I actually have a question, if you don't mind.
All right.
Could you talk a little bit more about the actual French people or French army and how some of the synopsis of this battle is that one of the takeaways was the French really had an impact with this battle. Would you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I do know that the French wanted to help America, but they were inching into it.
Yeah.
Another little trivia is Spain. Did you know Spain financed our Revolutionary War? Carlos III of Spain was the king, and he gave several $1 million through a front company in Paris called Rodrigo Hortalez and Company. And he didn't want to let the British know that he was favoring the Americans publicly because they were working on some treaty regarding Portugal. But he funnels supplies and money to the colonies through this front company. And then another Spanish was Cordoba. He was a admiral in the Spanish Navy. He captured 50 ships full of gunpowder and guns and supplies headed to America, headed to the British troops. And it was creative because the British fleet was coming out of the English Channel. It was nighttime, and they were following a lead ship, and the signal was, a couple cannon shots out of this side, a couple cannon shots out of that side, and then they would follow that at nighttime. Well, Cordoba gets in between the lead ship and the rest of the fleet, and he sees the signal, and he repeats the signal. And so the ships behind think he's the lead ship, and he leads this entire English fleet of 50 ships into a trap, and then they all have to surrender. And then there is Galvez. So Bernardo de Galvez was the governor of New Spain, which included Texas, Arizona, Louisiana, parts of Florida, all of the Central America, and the Caribbean. And so Bernardo de Galvez captures the British fort at Pensacola, drives the British out of Baton Rouge, out of Natchez, captures the Bahamas from the British, and his soldiers are made up of Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Venezuelans, and but who would have known that they would? And he allowed the Dutch ships to bring supplies up the Mississippi to the Ohio to supply George Rogers Clark, who was helping Washington on the west side of the Revolutionary War. And then, remember, the King of Spain finally sends a fleet, and it's led by Rochambeau, and they stop off in the French colony of Saint-Dominique, right? Haiti, right before the Haitian rebellion, and they're looking for money, and there's no money, and so Rochambeau says, I sent General Lafayette with a frigate over to Havana, and then the governor of Havana realizes that they're going to help Washington, and so he organizes a fundraising campaign, and the ladies of Havana, that's what they're called, donated their jewelry, their silverware, their candelabras. They donated an estimated $28 million worth of gold and silver. And they brought it up to Washington at Yorktown, and reportedly Washington threw his hat in the air, and Rochambeau writes in his journals, he says that the joy was immense when it was received. The American army, which was about to disperse, was then, re-energized and so forth, and that kept the army together so Washington could win. But the ambassador from U.S. to Cuba says that the ladies of Havana can truly be said to have given the bottom dollar upon which the edifice of the American Republic was built. Yeah. Who would have known that the ladies from Cuba? And so the ladies of Cuba had written a note with the money, and it says that the Americans' mothers would not have their sons be put into slavery, And then there was a Spanish captain named Jorge Farragut, and he comes over and joins the South Carolina Navy to fight the British. And after the war, his son, David Farragut, becomes the first U.S. Navy admiral. And he's the one that had the battle during the Civil War where he said, damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead. Right? That was David Farragut. But he was Spanish. So it's interesting that, and then Russia, Catherine the Great of Russia was one of the first to recognize America's independence, and that was pretty strategic. King of England was actually trying to get mercenaries from Russia and couldn't, so that's when she got the mercenaries from the Hessians. Anyway, but France, did you know what France got in return for helping us with the revolution? Nothing, but debt, lots of it. And then they had a couple years where their crops failed, and France was bankrupt. And the people of France blamed King Louis XVI. So they stormed the Bastille, they stormed Versailles, they ended up chopping off his head and did the French Revolution. Sort of sad that happened to France. But America, I was speaking this evening at a New Hope Church in Plymouth, Pastor Neil Eden, and I talked about how I like to study history. So from the beginning of recorded human history, the most common form of government is what? It's kings. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger, because with the latest military advancement, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon, an iron weapon, a phalanx spear that Alexander the Great's men had, a similar sword the Muslims had, gunpowder the Chinese had. The weapon keeps improving, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And these kingdoms keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger until the King of England was the biggest. And America's founders broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. In other words, the King of England was a globalist. He was a one-world government guy. The sun never set on the British Empire. He had India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guiana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. And America's founders decided they didn't like a globalist king telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. And then the idea is, where did the idea come from that you could have a nation with no king? When a king is the norm, it came from the New England pastors. Even the ones right here in Massachusetts. Where did they get their idea? From the Bible. What part of the Bible? Well, after the Reformation, you had John Calvin, and the emphasis was not just being thrilled you can read the Bible in your own language, but they began to study the first 400 years out of Egypt before Israel got a king. Lo and behold, the first instance, we're talking before the first instance of a nation with millions of people and no king was ancient Israel, that first 400 years out of Egypt. Right? They left the Pharaoh. They come into the promised land where there's King Agabashan and all these different kings. And for 400 years, Israel functioned with no king. And it wasn't like the Greeks and Romans, the Republic and the Democracy, where they would do trial and error. No, this is one download. Boom, Moses on the mountain. And the law says that everyone is made in the image of God, and this God is not a respecter of persons. It's the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. Right? Because wherever there's a king, it's hierarchical, like a pyramid. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. Or you're a slave. And it keeps getting bigger and bigger, right? It's this pyramid structure. And even Augustus Caesar, he wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census, a tax enrollment. If he could have had access to 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, I bet he'd been tempted to use that. Kings want to control people. They want to conquer and track them. But the first instance of a nation with no king was ancient Israel. And it worked because everybody was taught the law, and everybody was personally accountable to God to follow the law. So you're about to steal, nobody's around, and then you think God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates a tiny thing in your head called a conscience. If everybody believes this, you can maintain order with no police, with no king. And it worked for 400 years in Israel until the priests went woke. You say, what? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then another Levite with a silver graven image. The law says you're not supposed to have graven images. And then another Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. And the poor concubine gets raped to death by a bunch of sodomites. I mean, that's the book of Judges. And it turns into everybody does what's right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests went woke and stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. They all go to Samuel the prophet. And they say this self-government system's not working anymore. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they did not reject you, they rejected me. Why is this story important? The kings of Europe looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and after. And the Pilgrims and Puritans that founded Massachusetts looked to the pre-King Saul part of the Bible. Both of them are looking to the Bible. One's King Saul and after, and one's King Saul is before King Saul. And they have a covenant form of government where you get rights from God, you're fair to your neighbor because you're accountable to God. You get blessings from God. You voluntarily share them with your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. It's not socialism where the government takes away your stuff involuntarily, gives it to somebody you'll never meet, and they don't care where it came from. No, it's your stuff, and you move with compassion, and then you give out it, and they experience the love of God through a real person. It's called the covenant form of government. And so that's when the Pilgrims were coming, they were in light in Holland. You had Spain threatening to attack. It was an 80-year war of independence for the Netherlands to break away from Spain. And so the Pilgrims, after 12 years, decide they're going to come to America, and they were going to go to Virginia, and they get blown off course to Massachusetts. Try sailing south, almost sink, and they come back to Plymouth, and the captain of the Mayflower says, everybody get off the boat. And they're like, we have a question. Who's going to be in charge? We were going to go to Virginia, submit to the king's government. You're telling us to get off. There's 102 of us in the boat, and nobody's been picked by the king. They do something unique. They create their own government. They take their covenant church form of government, and they make it their civil government. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. Right? It's a polarity change in the flow of power on planet Earth. The whole world at this time, you have Indian Maharaja. Raja means king, Maha means great, right? In China, you have emperors. Japan, emperors. Korea, emperors. Russian czars. Ottoman sultans. Kings of Spain, France, and Austria. African chieftains. The whole world's top-down pyramid kings, right? And other than the Netherlands, where they had a degree of tolerance, the whole world was basically kings. What was happening in America was unique. This covenant form of government went from church to civil body politic. And then King Charles the First turns up the heat, and 20,000 Puritans, a fifth of the wealth of England, comes to Massachusetts. The ones that stay over there have a civil war and win, and for 15 years they have an American experiment until they brought King Charles II back. But in America, you have these Puritans come over and they take their covenant form of church government and they make it their civil government, and you literally had churches founding cities. Could you imagine that? And so Pastor John Wheelwright and his little covenant church found a city called Barnstable, Massachusetts. And a pastor, Thomas Hooker, and the First Congregational Church in America found a city, Hartford, Connecticut. And a pastor, Roger Williams, and his First Baptist Church in America found a city, Providence, Rhode Island. Pastors and churches founding cities? So everybody's involved in church and everybody's involved in city government because it's the church founding the city. There's like no non-church members tagging along to be lazy and let them run everything. And they would have one building in town called the meeting house. That's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law, and that's where they would do their city business. I mean, why build a separate building just to talk about a different topic? And so this impacted New England, it impacted our country, and did you know the word federal is Latin for covenant? And so we have a constitution that says what? We the people. The Declaration, government from the consent of the governed. Kings of Europe didn't ask the people for consent. Muslim sultans didn't ask the people. Russian czars didn't ask the people for their consent. What was happening in America was a polarity change. Instead of dead pyramid rule, top down through fear, it's like a living tree bottom up, where every root and every tiny capillary root sucks in nutrients to keep the tree alive. Right? And so this is what makes America great. You get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together are in charge of the country. We're a republic. Republics have citizens. And the word citizen, city, zen. It's an inhabitant of the city, but it's more than that. It comes from the Greek word polites. Polis means city, and politics is the business of the city, and polites is the citizen. And it means co-ruler, co-sovereign, co-king. It's popular sovereignty. The population is the sovereign, the king. And so the word citizen means, when we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic, we're pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. And so when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in rule. It's like, okay, somebody else will be glad to rule your life, and we'll go back to a king. But this idea of what happened in Massachusetts and what happened in New England turned into our Constitution and helped America become the freest and most prosperous nation that planet Earth has ever seen in its 6,000 years of recorded human history. That's why we want to preserve it. Because if America was gone, what's going to be left? Chinese dictators, Russian dictators, North Korean dictators, Iranian dictators. It is going to be a gang war on a global scale with human rights being crushed. So the Bible says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Our founders sacrificed their prosperity for their posterity. They pledged their lives and their fortunes for a generation yet unborn. Unfortunately, some today are willing to sacrifice their posterity for prosperity, saddling kids with an unpayable $37 trillion debt, and they don't care how it's going to get paid for, right? But we do care. And even if we can't turn it around, shouldn't we at least try? But I believe in God's providence, we can turn it around. When you think of the founders, the King of England was the most powerful globalist power on earth, and we had this ragtag thrown together army, but we had faith, we had courage, and God did miracles. And here we are. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you all for joining us. And there are some books of bills out in the lobby if you're interested. They're able to be purchased. And thank you for joining us, and we will see you in October. It is the Battle of Yorktown.